So I'm going to talk about some recent stuff that we've been doing in terms of sort of polishing fair use policies for the term LDBC benchmark, which has just been, well, earlier on this year was trademarked, and we're sort of been a lot of work going on to figure out how to control the way in which people talk about LDBC benchmarks and try and prevent misuse of the term LDBC benchmark. I'm the vice chair of LDBC, as it says here. Hopefully not for much longer, because we're trying to do some rotation of the jobs and responsibilities. But it's been an interesting couple of years, and lots has been achieved. And I guess this LDBC benchmark work is one of the last things in terms of the sort of professionalization of LDBC's operations that I will have been working on. So I guess what we're trying to do is squeeze out benchmarking and ensure or enable real benchmarking. And benchmarking I would define as using claimed benchmarking results for your product, which cannot be compared to results for other products in order to boost your marketing story. Whereas the aim of the benchmark standards that LDBC produces, which have a fixed process for independent auditing and include cost or price metrics, is precisely to enable comparable tests to be performed, which can then be used under very controlled conditions with a very sort of fixed process for the publication of results in order for consumers of technology that supports graph data workloads to actually make comparisons. And this accords with the goals that were originally laid out by the work that Jim Gray and others did in forming the Transaction Processing Council, TPC, back in the 1980s. So the background here is that LDBC, this hasn't sort of come from nowhere, the fact that we've been doing some work in this area. It's because LDBC benchmarks have become more and more popular. And they're used in all kinds of ways, which is great. And the whole idea of the benchmark standards was that they would be open and that they'd be accessible for research purposes, as well as the more sort of controlled, true benchmarking activities. So people use them, for example, very widely, I think, for internal product performance purposes. Many vendors do that. Or they just use them because it's the source of something like a standard data model, like the LDBC SMB data model is very widely used. You want to discuss, here's an example of a graph, we're going to talk about it. Everybody's seen one of these before. Sometimes people come up with performance numbers. They put them in white papers or, proto-academic papers and so forth, or in marketing press releases, etc. And sometimes they've also included performance numbers about competitors' products. And increasingly, very modest, but it's beginning to sort of pick up, we're actually seeing real audited benchmark results. So there's been a tendency for marketing departments of vendors, quite naturally, to try and associate their product with the positive reputation of LDBC benchmarks. And I think that it's very widely understood that there's a huge amount of work that's gone into the benchmarks, a great deal of knowledge and expertise. They're very high quality. People actually want to be able to take advantage of these benchmarks. So that is a positive reputation, and it's good for you if you're a vendor to be associated in some way with LDBC benchmarks. However, that association, in the absence of audited benchmark results, is very suspect. It's very easy to misinterpret or abuse that kind of association. And that's created tension, including among our member companies. People have been unhappy about company X or company Y and the way in which they've talked about their relationship with LDBC benchmarks. So we came to the conclusion after a lot of discussion, various kinds of forums and internally within LDBC, that we want LDBC benchmark result to mean one thing and one thing only, and that is audited results, official audited results. So in order to facilitate this, we registered the term LDBC benchmark, the bit that you see in capitals, as a trademark, starting off in the UK in order to sort of kick the process off to get precedence. From a time perspective, I think it's actually was registered in January, but that's being extended to China, the EU, Japan, USA, South Korea, Russia, Brazil, India, and Canada in 3 classes, which I won't bother to try and describe, but you can look them up from the Nice Treaty of WIPO. The reason we wanted this trademark is to be able to actually control the way in which people use the term LDBC benchmark. So we're going to do 2 things with this trademark. We will license you to use the phrase LDBC benchmark to describe the results of audited LDBC benchmark tests. And that's the only circumstance in which you can talk about an LDBC benchmark. We will not pursue you for infringing our trademark on the phrase LDBC benchmark in all other circumstances, if and only if you follow our fair use policy, which describes exactly how you can talk about LDBC benchmark. If you don't follow our fair use policy and go off talking about LDBC benchmarks, you lay yourselves open to the fact that we have that trademark and that we are committed to defending it. Now, standards, benchmark standards from LDBC produced by the task forces, they're approved by the voting members. Development of the standard includes trial or standards establishing audits performed by the task forces. The auditing process and rules vary somewhat or can vary between different benchmarks, but there's an overall framework provided by our LDBC bylaws. LDBC certifies auditors, auditors then certify results. LDBC doesn't get involved in that process directly. The only permitted variation in these tests is not things like I don't care about query X or I'm not interested in this bit of the workload or whatever. The only thing you can vary is the scale factor, and price or cost metrics, which were introduced by TPC in the 1980s, are part of the picture, but only for audited benchmark test results. You're not supposed to produce price cost metrics in any other context, and that's to permit proper comparability. So the licensing and fair use policies, I'm sure these presentations all get linked and distributed and you'll be able to follow links inside them. There's a link to the exact motion that was passed at the Board of Directors on the 22nd of May, and I'll go through the essence of this in a moment. This is going to be supplemented with sort of precise license documentation and various other bits of legalese, possibly FAQs to help people, because we're not trying to be unhelpful here. We're trying to encourage people to use the benchmarks, but do so, you know, in a way where people know what's going on. But these policies are in effect. They sort of apply to you, whoever you are, whether or not you're, you know, a member of LDBC, they definitely apply to you, or whether you're somebody using the materials that are being produced by LDBC, you know, externally. So there are 5 policies, and I'll go through them quickly. The first one, I'm not going to say again. Trademark is licensed only for audited results. I've already talked about that. Second thing is, you can only produce audited results if you're an LDBC member. We want to make sure that people come into LDBC, that they have a relationship with LDBC, that they paid some money to LDBC if they're a company, in order to be part of this process. Point of comparison, TPC charges you to do a audited benchmark. It charges you something like $2,000 per benchmark submission. So this is, A, has a precedent, but B, we're cheaper. But, you know, we're cheaper in general than TPC. Number 3, no hostile benchmarks. This means basically the policy says test sponsors, people who are allowed to produce audited test results, if they've got the auditor, must have the written permission of the producer, owner, head licensor, you know, whoever actually, owns this thing, in order to do an audited benchmark test. So that could be themselves. They can give themselves permission to do their own one. They can get permission from somebody else. Imagine you had a hardware vendor who had the collaboration of 3 software vendors or whatever. That's all fine. What you can't do is go, I'd like to do a test against Company X, and Company X has no intention of being involved, and so on and so forth. The reason for this is, if you don't have the willing collaboration of the experts associated with Company X or, you know, Project Y or whatever it is, you tend not to get a fair crack of the whip for the particular, you know, product concerned, and that's not what we're trying to do. We want the comparability to come from using the standards and the auditing process. If that is followed and you have the right cost metrics, you ought to be able to make comparisons. You don't have to do it all in a, you know, a sort of single block of tests. Number 4 is anything else that isn't an LDBC audited test result is not an LDBC benchmark result. You can't call it an LDBC benchmark result. In fact, more than that, you've got to prominently describe it at the first possible opportunity that you have as not being an LDBC benchmark result, right? And we're going to be very clear about the formal words you have to use, the short form, the long form, and all the rest of it, so that you have no ambiguity. It's easy. You just go, it's not an LDBC benchmark result. As long as you said that somewhere, you're sort of covered. That's the beginning of the picture. If you've got enough space, like an academic paper or a white paper or a press release where you've got, a paragraph is available to you, you should describe how your work relates to LDBC. But it might just be, we use the the data model. It might be, we've done everything except the following 4 tests. We've introduced 19 new queries because we want to extend what this thing does, and we're trying to innovate off the back of the LDBC. All fine, doesn't matter what it is, you just describe it. And therefore you make sure that people who are reading the material know what is the relationship of this work to it, the work that LDBC did. Is it extension? Is it partial? Is it an attempt to move towards a full benchmark result? Whatever you want to say, it's your way of describing it, but your responsibility is to do that accurately to keep people informed about what's going on. The last point is you shouldn't imply or contain comparison information if you're not doing an LDBC benchmark test result. So you shouldn't imply the work's endorsed by LDBC, you can't include price metrics, and if there are performance or functional test results that are included in your work, you ought to describe, you ought to make it clear that this is not to be used for comparison purposes, so that people understand exactly what is going on. And that's basically it. It's either call an LDBC benchmark result because you're doing audited tests, which is what we want to see more of, and we want to otherwise see every manner of use of LDBC's work. We don't care what you do with it, why you do it, how you take it as an inspiration, and so on and so forth, as long as you don't use it to claim you've done an LDBC benchmark and published results relating to it. So that's the story. I don't know whether anybody's got any questions at all on that, or whether they can leave it at that. Very happy to talk to anybody offline if they've got any questions, and I'm sure as time goes on, hopefully we'll continue to have the real world problems of people doing real things and working out exactly how to make this all sort of take place. That's the picture.